Board on this computer. Okay. Okay, we're in chapter 9 of the book, if I'm not mistaken. Didn't we just stopped on lesson, we got through with the lesson 8, which we're calling lesson 8 because we made the book into a book that way, and now we've gone into number 9. And somebody asked, I think Lawrence asked last week in reference to other material. There's in this book, there's 10 chapters, and so we've made 10 lessons out of those. And so what we're going to do is, before we cover the 10th chapter in this book that we've been studying, we're going to, there's some other things that we're going to do to talk about. We're actually going to go into certain cities like Antioch and Cyprus and so forth, and look at their way of life and how they made applications to a lot of things that we've studied about. And also that we're going to look up some other things. And I really wish that we had a way, or I knew the way, where I could use a PowerPoint, because I have a lot of pictures and things that I've gotten off the internet on archaeology. But in my archaeology class, we are actually studying in the New Testament archaeology, and so we picked up a lot of pictures, and a lot of it goes along with what we've done, and talking about roads and time and so forth, other things that we're going to talk about. And so it'd be interesting to the class if we could see those slides. But I just don't know how to use the slides with Zoom, and I guess I need to find out how to do that, because it would be a better thing that you could put the slide and let you look at the slide. But we have got down to, we're going to talk about our discussion. If I'm not mistaken, let me go back. Time, distance, and travels in the Roman world. Now, we're going to spend some time here because we have the time to do so, to use what they're saying, that we have the time that we can do. We can talk more about some of the passages of Scripture that we read all the time, and so we'll be doing that. Let's have prayer, then we'll begin. Holy Father, again, we're thankful for the day, for all the blessings of life. We're thankful for our safe journeys this day. We pray, Father, that continued blessings upon those who are traveling during this break from school, and we pray, Father, they'll have safe journeys. We're mindful, Father, of all those who are sick, in the congregations where we all attend. We pray, Father, thy blessings upon them, the doctors and nurses that are taking care of them. We're thankful, Father, for the knowledge and the experience they have, that they be able to help those that are in need at this time. We pray, Father, for those who've lost their loved ones. We pray that turn to thee and thy word for the strength and comfort that they need. Pray, Father, as we study thy word, that we will gain the strength and the courage and wisdom that we need as we sojourn here upon this earth, that we'll be able to be the faithful Christian that would have us to be. We ask thy blessings to be upon the Georgia School of Preaching and all their campuses and all those who attend the classes, that much good will be done for the things that we're doing. Forgive us in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Jumping Jim hadn't got in yet, but Jumping Jim is retiring from ROTC, and so
Bobby, I'm having a little problem with my hearing. I'm going to close out and come back in.
Who is you? Lawrence? Lawrence?
Yes, sir.
Is that you that's messing up? Is it yours that's messing up?
Sir?
Is your thing messing up, or is that Jim talking about? Who's hearing problem messing up?
It may be my computer.
Well, I can hear you just fine. You hear me?
It may be on my side, so I got to shut it down and come back in.
Okay, well, I'm set at 33. Let me set it higher. How's that? Okay.
No, what it does, it keep buzzing.
Okay, let me see if I got any. Make sure mine's plugged in. Well, I'm not buzzing. Anybody else? Well, most everybody else is put the mute button on, so they won't be able to talk.
I'm not buzzing.
Okay. So Rebecca's not buzzing because she's been on since about 30 minutes ago. Okay, we've gotten down to this part of our lessons, and also the book, and going from the book. We're talking about time and distance and travel in the Roman world. And in the modern world, you know, we measure time and distance precisely on either end of a continuum. from nanoseconds and millimeters to millennia and to light years and so forth. And we have been taught about time, ever since we were a child. And so he talks about, he says, in his play, The Clouds, the Athenian comic poet Aristophanes made fun of intellectuals who tried to measure how far fleas could jump. And so with our own precise instruments, we can actually calculate what fractions of an inch they jump and what part of a second it takes them to do it. I mean, we have things that are that precise, and though we cannot answer any better than Aristophanes things, and could the question of why anyone would want to even know such a thing, or we could plot a course to the moon and back, and it is therefore difficult for us to imagine being content to know that it's about midday or a 3-day journey to the next town. I know that most of us have watched the launches of the rockets and so forth, and watched the landing on the moon and so on, and yet there are people even in our own country that don't believe any of those things ever happened. It's just that they've showed them as like a movie from Arizona, from the desert and everything else. But we are very precise, and I think during the wars that we have fought, and especially since 2000, and been involved in the wars in over in Iraq and places like that. I'm trying to think. Kuwait was the one I was trying to think of. And all those in there, people saw what actually we could do, with bombs and stuff, that somebody be riding along their automobile and they could pinpoint that and be hundreds of miles away and blow that thing up. And so we are very precise about things. And now, if one of those people back in the New Testament times were to be raised from the dead, as we would say, come to the 21st century, they wouldn't know what to think about what we do. But when you look at the New Testament people, and the times in which they live, with just that sort of precision, I can't say the word precision, in their measurements of everything, and from the hours of the day to the number of the years that they had lived. In general, they had only a vague notion of the distance between their own towns or the next town up the road. And soldiers and merchants had a better idea of distances, but even they figured largely in terms of a day's march or a day's journey. And so the farther they got from the Mediterranean coast, the sketchier their knowledge became. And the sketchier it became because of up and down the hills and the mountains and so forth. Major highways were a part of the Roman world. And we'll talk some about that here, and we'll talk about it again when we talk about Antioch and Cyprus and other places in the weeks that come ahead, so that we can put some of the things that we've learned together and seeing the manners and the customs and their way of life, so that we can understand it better or have a better knowledge of their times and so. Major highways had names such as Via Appia, or the Appian Way that we find in the Bible. But in towns, the roads and streets rarely had names unless there was something distinctive about them. Such as in Acts chapter 9, verse 11, it's called, go to the street called Straight. And that was in Damascus. And that's where they were told to go, or that was where Ananias was to go, and or some group of tradesmen concentrated in one area, such as the street of the bakers or the tent makers. And so one of the comic playwriters depicts a character trying to give directions to a stranger in Athens. And the hilarity of the scene depends on the lack of street names and the stranger's lack of familiarity and with local landmarks, and so which provided the only means of giving directions. And probably many of us have gone through some of that also in reference to that of when we would travel, people try to give us directions, and yet now we have GPS, and so we can look it on GPS, but if we hadn't updated our GPS in the last few years, then we'd have a problem. But in Acts chapter 28, in verse 15, as Paul is traveling and has traveled and going on his way to that of Rome. In Acts chapter 28, verse 15, the Bible says, and from thence, when the brethren heard of us, they came to meet us as far as the Appian Forum, and that's the Appian Way, and the three taverns, whom when Paul saw, he thanked God and took courage. So the Appian Forum, or the market of Appius, what the American Standard says, was on the Appian Way. This is about 40 miles from Rome. The three taverns was about 30 miles from Rome. The place where Christians met the Apostle Paul when he came to appear before the Caesar. It was apparently named for Appius Claudius, and builder of the Appian Way, the major artery of the western Italy. So around the Forum was a region of swamp and marsh, and notorious in the ancient world for bad weather, mosquitoes, and expensive taverns for travelers, and nighttime noisy traffic of cargoes and passengers on new-drawn barges around a canal cut through the area. And so that was a description that's given of the Appian Way. It passes through the Appian Forum about 40 miles. Again, we said from south of Rome. The Appian Way is also called the Queen of Roads, and it's actually the forerunner for so many other roads on the three continents that was begun around 312 BC as a military road for the use of the Samnite Wars. I thought it was amazing that when I was serving in Vietnam, that our tanks would make roads, and the Vietnamese people would come along and they would actually use that for their carts and things, because of the tracks and everything just tore down everything, and so they could just use them as roads also. But the 132 miles to Capua must have been completed within about a decade, though originally it was paved with gravel. Its servicing was with stone began in 295 BC, and currently was finished by 135 at the latest. Now, ultimately, the Appian Way reached southward 360 miles from Rome to Brundisium, that of the Adriatic, I think the way you say that. The Appian Way had 8 main stations between Capua and that of Rome, 2 of which are mentioned in the book of Acts narrative. That is the Appian Forum and the treasures, the three taverns. And so when you get my notes, you'll notice, and I want to make this clear now, you'll notice I'll have note in there. That means I went somewhere else and got some more information, okay? Like you've been having an F, F and a page. Well, I didn't do that this time. This time I copied and pasted. On page 157 in Mr. Ferguson's, or Brother Ferguson's book, it is interesting there that when he talks about that of time, and he gives some descriptions in reference to time about Acts chapter 12 and so forth. But the modern Western obsession with time began in the medieval monasteries, where the monks needed some reliable device to awaken them in the middle of the night for their prayers. So their search had led us through pocket watches to wrist devices, whose makers preferred to call them chronometers. We are seldom out of sight of a timepiece and are virtually enslaved to that of schedules in work, in school, even in our entertainment, going to movies and so forth, and watching certain program on TV. We're just time conscious, you know. And like with me, I have, like most of you do, I have a cell phone. It has a calendar on there. It has the weather on there. It has just about everything on there that I need. I told someone the other day I was going to get me a flip phone and just go back to the old calendar, but I don't know if I will or not. But we are spoiled by those things, but back then they didn't have anything like that. The ancients were not as dominated by time as we are. So they never developed, as we would call it, precise instruments to calculate it, though not for want of trying. They did invent elaborate water clocks, which seldom agreed with one another. Cynical, the historian, about 4 BC to 65, says that even had small sundials which could be worn on the wrist or around the neck, but most ancient people recognized that their timekeeping could only be approximated about the so-and-so hour. And so is the way times are usually given, and such a casual system says something about fundamentally different these ancient people's worldview was from ours. And so, because of the computer and satellites and things like that, we can reach just about anything at any time. The reckoning of the day varied from one culture to another. Now, we're going to see that when we look at the different cities, that a lot of things varied. In other words, they may have the accommodations and things of that sort, and inns and so forth in different cities. In some places they didn't, and so on. But in the travel and so on, and even the streets, some of them were paved. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But Pliny, the elder, not the younger, the elder, he lived 23 to 79 AD. He summed up the situation like this. He says the actual period of a day has been differently kept by different people. The Babylonians kept the period between two sunrises. The Athenians, that between two sunsets. The Umbrians, from midday to midday. The common people everywhere from dawn to dark. The Roman priests and the authorities who fixed the official day, and also the Egyptians, the period from midnight to midnight. Now, our time is kept as we would look at the 24-hour day. It starts at 12 midnight to 12 the next night. And then at 12 midnight, we start another day. And officially, the Greeks and the Jews reckoned days from sunset to sunset, while the Romans began at midnight. But for all ancient people, the day in ordinary terms became at sunrise, in the mornings. And they would call that the beginning of the day. And, they weren't like us. We spring forward and fall back and all that kind of stuff. I personally wish they'd split the difference and just leave it alone and quit messing up my sleep time. But a question does come up as we study with people in reference to about the change of time, because the Jewish people did count their days from the evening to the evening, and the Roman people would do theirs at midnight to midnight. And so why did we change? And we changed because all the Jewish laws and so forth, all of those things were done away. And so most people numbered days in a simple manner, such as the 5th day of the month X. The Romans, though, contrived a cumbersome system based on 3 reference points. And that's the kalends, the nones, and the idea. Now, the kalends was always the first day of a month. But the nones, or nuns, I guess is what you'd say that, and the ides varied depending on the month. The nuns usually fell around the 5th to the 7th day of the month, and the ides around the 13th to the 15th. So days were counted backwards from the next one of these reference points, and thus any day after the ides of the month would be counted as so many days before the kalends of the next month. And so I don't know how they done that, because I can read that and I still can't get straight in my mind how they did it. But that's the way they would keep time. So everybody would have a different way of keeping that of time. Now, when we think about the hours, subdivisions of the day varied from culture to culture. The Greeks and the Jews used no former hours, but they described the parts of the day by the activities carried on at such and such time. For instance, if you go to John chapter 13, and down in verse 38, Jesus answered there, talking to Peter, says, "Wilt thou lay down thy life for my sake? Verily, verily, I say unto thee," talking to Peter, "the cock shall not crow till thou hast denied me thrice." So, it's the cock crow. And so the cock would crow. And so you look in not only John 13:38, you go to Acts 17:17, and also Exodus 40 verse 4. The early Jews lacked a formal system of timekeeping, can be seen in the fact that there is no word for hour, H-O-U-R, in the Old Testament. Now, when I read that, I said, well, I don't know. So I went back and I looked up hour. You could find the word time, but you can't find the word hour except in the book of Daniel, which many scholars feel is quite late. So from the Maccabean period, about 164 BC, when the Jews were under the Hellenistic influences, as noted as we looked at in lesson 2. But Daniel, in Daniel chapter 3, verse 6 and 15, and chapter 4, verse 19 and 33, and chapter 5, verse 5, it uses the word hour. And so the Greeks developed the concept of the hour a period of 1/12 of the total daylight, but they didn't use it widely to reckon time until after the era of Alexander the Great. He died in 323 BC. So under their system, the day was divided into 12 hours of equal length. And so the hour did not have a fixed value, but would vary in length with the season, ranging from 45 of hour minutes in December to 75 minutes in June. So an elaborate timekeeping mechanism. The Tower of the Winds was actually built in Athens to serve as a public timepiece. Now, the Romans borrowed this system from the Greeks, even though it was inaccurate in Rome because it was reckoned on the latitude and longitude measurements taken in that of Greece. Now, Jesus takes the Greco-Roman time system as a normative when he asked, are there not 12 hours of daylight? John 11 and verse 9. And even in the parable of Matthew chapter 20, verses 3 through 16, there Jesus portrays the owner of a vineyard hiring laborers first at the beginning of the day, then at the third, then at the sixth, then at the ninth, then at the 11th hour. So we're talking probably roughly between 9 a.m., noon, and 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. Now, except at the crucifixion, the hours of the day do not figure prominently in the first three Gospels. So Jesus was apparently put on the cross at the third hour. Then there was darkness from the 6th to the 9th hours, at which point he died, Matthew 15, 25, and verse 33. And so they did, in the New Testament, we find that taking place in reference to the times as they give. Like in John's Gospel, probably written in the Greek city of Ephesus and less closely tied to a Judean background than are the other three. There are several references to hours. For instance, in John 1, verse 39, Andrew's first meeting with Jesus is said about the 10th hour. That's about 4 p.m. In John 4 and verse 6, Jesus encounters the woman at the well at about the 6th hour. So that's about noon. Now, to me, that's like 6 a.m. in the morning. Then 6 hours later is 12. So it'd be noon. So a singular reference to the 7th hour occurs at 4:52 John, about 1 p.m. And then we would find that John places the crucifixion about the 6th hour. That would be noon, but he does not mention the darkness in reference to how that it became dark. I got to change something right now, okay? And so reference to the 6th and 9th hours are so common in ancient literature that they seem to have been a way of saying that the author did not know exactly when something really happened, only that it was sometime around noon or just after the midday siesta. And so each time is not especially important to the meaning of the story. John's mention of the 7th and the 10th hour thus becomes all the more peculiar and perhaps was a more historically accurate and original part of these stories, or it may have been just symbolic significance, which we no longer grasp. So the book of Acts, when we turn to it, also contains a number of references to the hours of the day. We always think about, I guess, Acts chapter 2, when the apostles begin to preach, and we find in Acts 2 and verse 15 that the Bible points out to us there. It says, for these are not drunken as you suppose, in it, but the third hour of the day. So here's Peter as he is defending the disciples against these charges by pointing out that it was only the third hour of the day. In other words, it's only 9 o'clock in the morning, much too early to be drunk. And then in Acts chapter 3 and verse 1, he also is now Peter and John went up together into the temple at the hour of prayer, being the 9th hour. So that hour also figures in the story of Cornelius in the centurion in lesson 10. He prayed at the 9th hour, saw an angel in a vision, and the next day Peter also received a vision about the 6th hour. So again, if we were to look at in reference to what Peter is saying, that this is just the third hour of the day, then it's 9. 6th hour of the day would be at noon. Then the 9th hour of the day would be 3. And as we would look here, he says the 6th hour would be 12 when he received us. Let me go back. The hour of the prayer was the 9th hour, so at 6 was 12. 6 was 12, and then 3 p.m. was the 9th hour. And so That would be the way they would tell the time. Now, the night was also divided into hours, but it's rare to find these specified. Most commonly, the Romans spoke of the watches of the night. They're like 4 shifts of 3 hours each. It's amazing to me because I look at that, and every time I think about it, is when we were in Vietnam, when we were out in the jungle, that we would pull 2-hour shifts. But we always look at the watch. I guess we would have something like this if we didn't have a watch. But in Mark chapter 6 and in verse 48, it is said, and he saw them toiling in rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them about the 4th watch of the night. He cometh unto them walking up on the sea, and would have passed by. And also Luke 12, verse 38. Most things that happen late at night were described simply as occurring at midnight. Acts 16, verse 25, Paul and Silas were praying in the prison about midnight when they were freed from their bonds. Paul once preached unto midnight, while the unhappy results that a young man dozed off and fell out of the window where he was sitting, Acts 20, verses 7 through 12, and one of the few references to a specific time at night occurs in Acts 23, verse 23. But the tribune, Claudius Lysias, who had arrested Paul in Jerusalem, sent him to the governor Felix at the 3rd hour of the night. Well, that was to avoid a plot on Paul's life. Now, if it's the 3rd hour of the night, it would seem to me if it's 6 p.m. would be the beginning of the day, or of the night, we would say, just like 6 a.m. is the beginning of the day, then that would be around 9 o'clock p.m. If we were to look at, again, 6, 9, 12, 3, then 6. Then we'd go 6, 9, 12, and 3 for the nighttime. So there are enough references in measuring time in the New Testament to establish that the Jews of that day followed the Roman habit of counting the 12 hours in the day from dawn. But also, like Romans, they were never precise in their reckoning, preferring vague terms like toward the evening or early dawn. Now, sometimes we get in discussions, and you'll see this taking place too. We'll get in discussions with people about the Sabbath day, and most of the time what we usually do is we'll go to the ends of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John after Jesus has died, and right before he is resurrected, he'll talk about the first day of the week, and showing therefore that yes, he rose on the first day of the week. And so there was, and most of the time we'll say, well, we see that there is a shift in change of days, the day that we're supposed to worship. We worship on the first day of the week. I've often thought about that, and even more so since we've done this course. Jesus is the light of the world. And if we walk in the light, our sins are continuously forgiven, 1 John 1, verses 7 through 9. But since he's the light of the world, was the first miracle when creation of the world was on the first day God created light. And I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but I've often thought in reference to that he's the light of the world, and it's on the first day of the week. He was resurrected upon the first day of the week. He comes forth really as the light of the world, because through him we have the forgiveness of our sins because of our obedience to the gospel. But also if we walk in the light, then our sins are forgiven. We find also at this time some inserted material, the telling of the time. In Matthew 27, verse 45, now from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness over the land. I brought that up and we didn't say anything about it. In John 11, verse 19 also, are there not 12 hours in the day, Jesus said. So again, telling time was a little different and a little more sophisticated than it had been in the Old Testament. The Old Testament was different. The day as a period of time, as we said, was divided. Back in the Old Testament, the evening and the morning were the first day. The evening and the morning were the second day, and all the way through. And so then we find in the New Testament that we see it roughly from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and the night from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. So that's the way we look at it. So even each individual, each was divided in those 12 hours. Dawn and midday were complete designations and easy to determine. And, I can recall that when I was a kid chopping cotton, and my mother and my brothers and sisters were picking cotton, that they didn't have watches. It was out in the field. And so they'd look and they would just say, well, it's about time for us to eat. And I thought to myself, how in the world do you know it's time to eat? And they said, well, because where the sun is. And so they could look up at the sun. And sure enough, it wouldn't be long. They come to us, all right, it's time to eat dinner. And so we'd eat dinner. Some places that we did that, the person that we was working for, they fixed dinner for everybody. And everybody went in their house or sat on the porch and we ate together. But Jesus was crucified at the third hour, 9 a.m., Mark 15, verse 25, and darkness descended upon the land from the 6th to the 9th hour, from noon to 3 p.m. And also the morning sacrifice took place at the third hour and the afternoon sacrifice at the 9th hour. And so in New Testament times, Jews followed that Roman custom of dividing, again, the times into those 4 watches, evening, morning, cock crowing, and the morning. Evening, midnight, cock crowing, and morning. Jesus walked on the water, as we said, in the 4th watch of the night. Sundials and water clocks served as a way of telling time. We mentioned that. The Jewish month began with the renewal of the moon. In other words, they had a lunar calendar, and it was 360 days. And so you stop and think about that. So basically 4.5 days, or 4 days, or 4.25 days was missed. And so the Jewish people would have, if you take that and multiply it out, they had an extra month because of that. They would come along every so many years and they'd have extra month. But we have 364 days, and then every 4 years we have 365. So they were 12 months in each solar year. Let's see now. The Jewish began with the renewal of the moon. Therefore, they had a lunar calendar of just over 29 days in each month. There were 12 months in each solar year, and so the Jews saw the discrepancy between the lunar and the solar year and added extra days in the lunar year to bring the two into conformity. So Julius Caesar instituted a calendar-related reform late in his administration around 46 BC, and we would find it was based on the Egyptian calendar. So it was only a few hours in error, but of course this calendar was followed throughout the Roman Empire in Jesus' day. The Venerable Bede, an Anglo-Saxon monk, discovered in 730 that Caesar's calendar was 11 minutes and some seconds too long each year, making an error of a day every 128 years. But nothing was done about it until 1582, when Pope Gregory the 13th produced a calendar that dropped 10 days. Various countries of the world gradually adopted the Georgian calendar, they called it, and Britain and her colonies did so too in 1752. The Soviet Union made the change in 1918, and Turkey in 1925. Now the whole world is on one calendar. And so that's how it became. I mean, again, in my mind, if you're doing like the Jewish, because they're doing the lunar calendar and so on, or we're doing the sun calendar, or what is, you lose those days, and how do you make them up? Well, now it's fixed so that we have 364 days, and every 4 years we have 365 in that year. And so everybody's on the same calendar, but we're not on the same time. But we do still have the time references. And so that gives you the time. But then about the weeks, one of the demarcations of time, most familiar time to us, is the week, a concept which determines the very rhythm, I guess, of our life, was lacking in the ancient thought beyond Judaism. In Galatians 4 and verse 10, Paul wrote, he says, you are observing special days and months and seasons and years. Now, there's no mention of weeks. The special days and seasons made reference to the fascination which some early Christians had with astrology, a phenomenon discussed, we talked about in lesson 5. The astrologers didn't count a cycle of 7 days, each one named after one of the heavenly bodies thought to govern it, sun, the moon, and the 5 planets. But no one other than the Jews lived by a fixed pattern of weeks. And so this doesn't mean that the ancient people never had a break from their drudgery. The normal work day ended at noon, as we saw in lesson 7. Market days were held 7 times a month, and every 8th or 9th day, or in connection with the magistrates' visits in their cities, or with a religious festival. The Romans' calendar contained 150 holidays. 150. I wonder if they got paid. And I wonder if they got double time if they worked on that day. But each town in Providence had its own civic and religious celebration as well. We'll see that when we look at some of those cities. It seems unlikely that any of the free or Roman ever worked himself to death. Slaves were generally included in those holidays. In other words, they got the holidays also. And so that's the way that they would do in reference to weeks. And then the months. Now, I tried to find, and I haven't done it yet, I do know that my Dixon Bible has the Jewish months, and so I don't, I'll have to try to find those. The Jewish months, and how many days they are, and how they relate to our calendar, and there were certain readings done on those in those months, and so forth, and I'll have to find that because it was interesting. But when we think about the months were reckoned by the phases of the moon. Now, but a lunar year is 355 or 56 days. It doesn't coincide with a solar year. All ancient people inserted extra months periodically to make up the difference between the lunar and the solar years. Some Jewish sects use a 360-day calendar or one of 364 days. And so you can just imagine now in our own minds, imagine that each area, maybe each country, each province, each group of people had their own calendar. Some may have 360, some may have 355 or 356 or 364. And that's the reason why eventually it all came down to the way that we have it today. A primary function of the priests now, they had their responsibilities that was given to them in the Old Testament, but there were, we have found, and we probably understand this, that all cults in the Old Testament had their priests. They all had priests. Even the idolatrous people had priests. So, but a primary function of a priest, no matter what it was in all cultures, was to keep track of discrepancies between the lunar and the solar year and announce when an intercalary month needed to be added. So the problem was that this process could be politically manipulated. The need for an extra month could be discovered just when a politician needed extra time in power. Greeks and Romans and Jews each had their own names for the months, and contracts and other official documents often give the name of the month in 2 or more of these systems. So in other words, when they would draw up a contract or say they're going to help one another and they would date it, if it was between the Jews and between the Egyptians, what kind of date are you going to use? Or are you going to use both of them? Most times they'd use both of them if it was, and not on that, but if there was a number of them, and then they would say if it was the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Jewish people and maybe another country, then you'd have, if they had 4 different ways of doing that, that's what they would be on the contract. But again, Julius Caesar greatly simplified all of that, because he introduced this system of months of being 30 and 31 days, and a leap year with an extra day every 4 years. So though not universally popular when it was introduced, his Julian calendar is the one we still use. So with slight modifications, again made by 1582 by Pope Gregory XIII, the update became necessary because of Caesar's astronomers figured the solar system as 365 and 1/4 days when it actually is 11 minutes and 14 seconds shorter. So for greater precision, years divisible by 100 should be leap years, but not those years divisible by 400, to which people have been added an extra day. So that may not seem like much, but over 16 centuries, it adds up like compound interest, so that there's a need of a correction. So 10 days were dropped again off the calendar in 1582. Now, the earliest Roman year may have had only 4 months in it with weeks of 8 days. So 4 times 8 would be 32. Some of the months got their names from certain activities associated with them. And it would be nice. Now, again, I haven't found this. I look for things because of it's of interest. That if you could find all the different names that people gave to the different days of the week or the different months. But by the time of the early Republic, 6th century BC, the Roman year began in March. I think that's great. That's when I was born, in March. Thus, the months of September through December were given names meaning 7 through 10, because at that time they were the 7th to the 10th month. And so in the middle of the 2nd century BC, for some reason, the Romans decided to begin the year in January, just after their winter time. So yet they retained the old names of the months, unless they decided to rename one in someone's honor. Quintilius was renamed July to flatter Julius Caesar. And thankful, this fellow that wrote the book says, I am a Yankee Doodle dandy born on the 4th of Quintilis. Just doesn't have the same ring to it. But then, of course, Augustus had to have Sextilis name after him. So Nero tried to rename April in his honor, and Domitian changed September to be Germanicus to celebrate his triumph over some tribe north of Danube. Neither change outlived their unpopular emperors. And so the poet Ovid began work on a poem called the Fasti about the origins of the names of the months and the significant anniversaries, but left it unfinished at his death. So there's a lot to be said about some things in the Old Testament, and one of those things is that during the days of Joshua and the Judges, the Hebrews did not produce commodities for export. So they did not travel or do commerce during these centuries. The work of livelihood of the populace consisted essentially of substances, agriculture, and the production of necessities for them. And so life generally revolved around the rhythm or the activities of the season. The Gezer calendar was discovered by McAllister in his excavation of Gezer and dated around 925 BC. I'll make a correction there. I don't want y'all to see all of my bad stuff. Wait just a minute. Let me get all that straightened out. Well, it didn't straighten it out. It did. So it began, this Gezer calendar, dated about 925 BC, confirms this. It begins with 2 months of olive harvest. That's mid-September to mid-November. Now, if I find that Jewish calendar, if I can make a copy of it out of my Dixon Bible and give it to you, you'll see some of this taking place, the mid-September to mid-November. It continues with 2 months of planting grain, wheat and barley, mid-November to mid-January, and follows with 2 months of late planting, January to March, involving chickpeas, melons, and cucumbers, and the like. March and April was the month for hoeing up flax and cut with the hoe near the ground for making cord, linen cloth, and the like. April or early May was the month of the barley harvest, and after that was the month of the wheat harvest and the festivity, later known as Pentecost. So next came 2 months of grape harvest in June and July, rather than 2 months to prune and to clean the grapevines, as the translations used to be rendered. Finally, in August came the month of summer fruit, with figs and grapes and pomegranates and other fruits could be picked. And so that was during the days of Joshua. Now, the way that they kept years, years were counted as in a chaotic fashion. And this is a thing, and I know that I may have said it here too, but in our study at the Buford campus on the book of Ezekiel, the fellow's commentary that we used, he used the Babylonian chronicles and dated things in the book with that. And also in the same group of commentaries, the truth commentaries that school uses, we have studied biblical archaeology, and they do the same thing in there, and it helps us with dating. And so you see, as we're going to look at how The Jewish people kept it. I mean, I don't know how they ever kept up with time, but the Babylonians kept up with time. So years were counted in a chaotic fashion. Not only couldn't the Romans decide when to begin the year, they didn't have any starting point for counting them. So the foundation was a semi-legendary event that took place in the forgotten past. So they simply didn't count the years. They named each year after its two councils and made no effort to number them. And so the problem was that all other cities had their own systems of reckoning years, and none of them coincided. The Athenians named their years after one of their archons, that is their chief magistrates, but their years started in July. You know, now again, a while ago we saw that some of them started in March. So throughout antiquity, kings counted years from the beginning of their reigns. But that meant that the count started over when a new king came to power. And so the count was different in each king's reign, 2 Kings 18:9 through 10. And so this created ultra confusion in trying to coordinate chronologies from one domain to another. Thus, the year 225 BC would have been the 21st year of Ptolemy's the third, the second year of Seleucus the third, and the 16th year of Attalus the first. Imagine yourself a business person trying to date a contract under those conditions. Now, I have a number of, chronology books in my library, and they're interesting to go back and try to, to look at them and to see how they counted things and how they try to get up with the years. And but archaeology has helped a lot, even proving some of the chronologies to be wrong. And so sometimes even now we update our New Testament chronology because of things that are being found. There was just a find here about 2 weeks ago in the city of Jerusalem, and they are digging there, and they have opportunities with the locust people for you to go there. If you want to go there for $18.95, that's $1,895. And you have to carry clothing with you to dig, because you'll be digging, be able to experiment like an archaeologist if you want to go. And it would be a good thing. The only thing is, it is a denominational thing, and they would have the denominational slang to just about everything. Like they're going to take a trip to Megiddo, and so they'll start talking about the Battle of Armageddon. That's yet future according to them. But it would be a good trip. And we have also, if I'm not mistaken, Gospel GBN, Gospel Broadcasting Network. I think they have some trips too. That would also be good to take if you ever wanted to take one of those. But the Roman emperors provide a certain degree of standardization. Now, again, God has a plan. And as we look at that, we find that since he has a plan, everything has to come into being to help that plan go out. I mean, to be accomplished. They all speak the common language was Koine Greek. The synagogues have been set up and things of that sort. Here's the Roman Empire, one of the biggest Roman empires. The Jews actually have a lot of freedoms among the Romans. But then the gospel comes along, starts preaching the gospel, the church being established and so forth. And there's uprisings in reference to that of the Jewish people against Christians and so forth. And eventually, because again, the destruction of Jerusalem was going to come because it's prophesied to take place. And so he had a plan. And so here we see a lot of these things taking place under the Roman government. So the Roman emperors provided the standardization. When Luke refers to the 15th year of Tiberius, he at least knows how long that emperor had been on the throne, but he says nothing about how long anyone had ruled before or after that. So to illustrate how cumbersome this system was, let's figure in Romans terms how many years elapsed from the beginning of Jesus' ministry to the death of the Apostle Paul. Okay, assuming Paul was executed in AD 64. That's the 10th year of Nero's reign. Jesus has began his ministry in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. We would have to know how longer Tiberius ruled, 8 years, the length of Caligula's reign, 4, and that of Claudius, 13, and those figures don't even take part of years into account, and then add them up, plus 10 to bring us up to the current year of Nero's rule, and we would have an answer. But that's what you would have to do. To put in modern terms, if someone claimed to be born on the 8th year of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency, how would you calculate that person's age? We would have to know how many years Roosevelt was in office and the names and the terms of all the presidents from that time to the very present to do that. And still, again, we wouldn't have the everything. That probably be very precise, but we'd be very close. So perhaps now we can see why people in the first century would have been satisfied to say, well, about 30 or 35 years from Jesus' death to Paul's, and let it go at that. And so the precision that matters so much to us was of little concern to them. They could not have achieved it if they had even wanted to. But yet we can find that somewhere along the line that Jesus was 33 and a half years old when he was crucified. That's what we mostly say in trying to figure that. Okay. The next point that in the book that we'll talk about is about birthdays. And I just had one, so, last month. My wife's, my sister's, my brother's, and who else? My uncle who passed away. All their birthdays April the 17th. So we get a lot of birthday cake at that time. But people who don't like to reveal their age would have been comfortable living in the ancient world. Whether or not people kept track of their age was left up to themselves. Now, just to stop there, we have seen that in our lifetime. I know some black folks that I sold furniture to and would go and collect from, and some of them did not know their birthday. I mean, I would ask. They said, I don't know when I was born. And there was no birth certificates and things of that sort. And I said, well, you got to know when you were born, And they said, well, we don't have birth certificates. And so, and that was going to cause a problem because when they got, the age of, I don't know when they changed the Social Security thing, 62, 65, when they got to that age, they'd have to try to prove their age. And the way they did that, they could take their mothers or somebody's that had the record of them and had maybe, say, for instance, they got married when they were 18 years old and have the year out that and had that in the Bible. They would accept the Bible or any type of announcement like that that had a date in it and give them their benefits. And so those things are very important. They're documents. And right now, they're available. You can order them. You have to pay for them, $10 a piece unless they've gone up. But yet they didn't keep up with their age. We have tombstones from the 2nd century BC and later, which give the age of the deceased sometimes down to the month and the day, like this. To the eternal memory of Blandinia, Martilia, most blameless girl who lived 18 years, 9 months, and 5 days. Marcus, Bodecius, Cressius, freeman of Marcus, built this for his son Petronius Volcanius, aged 18 years and 3 months and 18 days. But the dating is sometimes vague, regardless of whether the person is young or old. To Aurelia Vercella, my wife and most sweet, now that was nice, who lived 17 years, more or less. Lucas Stadius Onesimus, who lived 68 years, more or less. See, they didn't put down the dates. And my wife likes to go into cemeteries because she does genealogy. So we've gone places, and we would find where people would die, and and sometimes I don't think I've ever seen a tombstone that did not have a date of birth on it. I have seen some that didn't have a date of death. They died and then they were buried later. And sometimes people are moved. Just try to collect Social Security by telling them you're 65, more or less. You may not get it, more or less. People sometimes figure their ages by linking them with memorial events. Pliny the Younger was 61 to 112 AD. He knew he was 17 when Vesuvius, 79 AD, erupted. Now, that was volcano. But sometimes the events that stood out in people's memories were ones of local significance, such as a flood or a sensational crime. If an individual kept track of his own age, he could be assured of a precision. If he didn't, though, no one was going to do it for him. So determining the exact age of a person who lived in a remote part of the empire and who was long since dead was really kind of impossible. You go to Luke chapter 3, and down in verse 23, let's see here. The Bible says, and Jesus himself, being about 30 years of age, being as was supposed the son of Joseph, who was the son of Heli. So it tells us all he can when he says Jesus was about 30 when he began his ministry. So we should not try to make that mean more than it does. That's when he started his ministry, and it was about 3.5 years long. So if he was exactly 30, then he was 33 and 6 months years old when he was crucified. But since it was about 30, it could have been less than 30, you know. The execution, though, let me see if I'm going to do this before. Yeah, let me do this right quick, and then we'll take a break. The execution of John the Baptist marred Antipas' rule. John's denunciation of Antipas for his marriage to his brother's wife, Herodias, precipitated this murderous act, and Antipas' first wife was a daughter of Arthas the fourth, and whom he divorced to marry Herodias, wife of his brother Herod. And the reason for John's opposition to Antipas' second marriage was that the Mosaic law forbade brother's wife to accept to raise up their heir for a childless brother who died prematurely, the Levite marriage, Leviticus 18 and chapter 20, and Deuteronomy chapter 25. Antipas' brother was still alive and had an adult daughter, so John's condemnation won Herodias undying hatred, and she saw her chance to do away with John at Antipas' birthday party. So when his daughter Salome danced, won Antipas' proof. Matthew 14, Mark 6. Now, the reason I brought that up is because I was searching for birthdays, and the only birthdays came up was that the birthday of Jesus, or about the birth of Jesus, and then also about the birth of, talk about Antipas, his birthday party. Okay, let's take a break. I'm going to leave the recorder on and so forth, but I am not going to cut that thing off. Forget to cut it back on. So I guess everybody else is doing all right. So we'll take a break at 7:25 on the computer, but we'll come back. Have a break. Me too. Boom, boom, boom. Ooh, I'm late. I got to talking out there in the hallway, so I'll be late. Okay. There is this significance of the Emperor Cup. I don't see. Jumping Jim never did come back. I don't know what happened to him. I might have, let me check my email here. Make sure I sent. I bet I didn't send him. He has 2 emails and. Yeah. Let me ask y'all something other. Now, I think I asked y'all this last week. When I go away, I'm going away right now. I'm gonna put my Bible program up. Okay. Now, y'all still see me, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So now, how would I do a PowerPoint if I could put? Y'all don't see my screen. Y'all don't see my notes. All y'all do is see me. Okay. I'll try to figure that out because I would like for y'all to see some of those things that we can get in reference to the archaeological finds and so forth that helps us to understand some of these like time and so on. Well, anyway, we talked about, we've mentioned because we talked about the Caesars, and if you ever, like a lot of times when you study Book of Revelations, they bring up the occult, the emperor cult. The first emperor cult worship dominated local public life. I mean, well, the emperor worship dominated local public life. The calendar of the cult, they had a calendar, tended to bring an order to public affairs with the special observance of days, months, and seasons. Now, this is the cult. The chief citizens filled the priesthood of the imperial cup. So as priests, they sought to gain social and political and prestige by means of service to the emperor. And so they would, they wound up building temples and other buildings. And again, if we could show some of the things they found from archaeology and even some of the renewals, rebuilding of those buildings, you'd see. If you ever want to look at those things, you need to just go online and look up anything you want to look up the Moabite stone, and it'll give you everything that says all an image, hit the image, and it'll show you just bundles of stuff. But the same will do with reference to that of the Caesars, if you want to look them up. But commonly, the games, when they stopped and do this, they'd build all these temples and other buildings, and they would be staging games. Now, when I grew up, they would have these movies, about the gladiators and all that kind of stuff, Hercules, and I'd go watch those things. I thought they were good, And now, I appreciate them now because I have some in my mind, pictures in my mind, how some of these games that they play, the gladiator shows for public entertainment and so forth, and so on. But they would do that in the name of the emperor. And commonly the games and the festivals held in a community were jointly sponsored by the imperial cult and one of the other deities, like Diana in Acts chapter 19. So the cult priests also made numerous benefactions in terms of distribution of grain and oil and feast and banquets for the less fortunate. So in other words, they would take care of those who were less fortunate than they were. And so what cities could offer their inhabitants commonly came as a result of the imperial cult. The wealthy and ambitious could find through the imperial cult a means of impressing their communities and achieving power and authority. They were not really interested in public welfare. And so in this way, the emperor would gain and maintain the loyalty of his subjects and guarantee the stability of the government and societies because of what they did for them. And so secondly, the emperor worship erected one of the chief deterrents to the advance of Christianity. As we've already noted, the calendar revolved around the worship of the emperor and the promotion of his affairs. For instance, the birthday of Augustus was a holiday. Like I said, they had 150 holidays, some of them. So all festivals and games were held in the honor of Roma, the divine emperor, and or one of the pagan gods. The sacrifices in honor of the emperor or one of the other gods provided the chief source of meat, which the Council of Jerusalem forbade Christians to eat, abstain from things offered to idols, Acts 15:29. The feast held in the dining rooms located in temple gardens had a main feature, the serving of meat and other foods offered to idols. And so here it helps us now understanding why that they had this problem about eating these meats. Nothing wrong with them. The Old Testament law has been done away with. There's nothing wrong with eating these meats. What is an idol? That's what Paul asked. What is an idol? It's nothing. It's nothing. It's not a God. It's nothing. There's only one God. So it wasn't anything wrong with eating the meat, but it did cause a problem. The whole society was wrapped up in the ruler cult, so those who tried to live as consistent Christians stayed away from the festivals, the games, the dramas, and all the other social events with religious connection. And I don't know how y'all do. I mean, I know how I do. I don't go to those places. I have been invited to speak in the denominational things, and I try to stay away from those things if at all possible. I do funerals and probably and weddings and things of that sort. And I have spoken to religious groups on post-traumatic stress disorder and the book that I wrote in reference to that in the Bible. And I spoke at like the American Legion, the DFW, and that type of thing. And, but most people know who I am, but I stay away from those things, just like these people did. Christians could not conceal their beliefs and practice from other citizens of the country, and we can't do that. We cannot hide and periodically, be targeted. You remember in Acts chapter 19, verse 23 there, because of what was taking place in the city of Ephesus, that the mob Demetrius, the silversmith, incited in Ephesus is a case in point. You're not supposed to do things like that. Christians can't be involved. Somebody asked me one time, said there was going to be a protest. And I said, well, I can understand protest and so forth, but Bobby Gates is not going to show up. I'm not going to do that, and I'm not going to be involved in that type of thing and so forth. There's other things that I can do, and I don't get involved in protests, and I sure don't want to be in the riot. So, a large part of the persecution of the early Christians had nothing to do with the actions or wishes of ruling emperors, but arose from local conditions. And when the day came that the emperors tried to pressure everyone into the empire to engage in worship of the goddess Roma and the emperor, or suffer the consequences, the Christians were already strong. Therefore, public pressure proved to be a real deterrent to acceptance of the gospel. People didn't want to obey the gospel. And I'm afraid that because of what's going on in our country, that might be the problem today, that we have some of that same type of problem, that people don't want to obey the gospel of Christ because of, we're going to stand up and say, these things are wrong. They're sinful. And, I had eat at Zaxby's, and I'm a preacher, so, eat the bird and preach the word. That's what we say. So I eat chicken. I like chicken in all different ways, and in casserole and all that kind of stuff. It's probably one of my favorite Well, it probably is my favorite meat. So I do like to eat hot dogs every once in a while, hamburger. But I eat a lot of chicken. I was in the Zaxby's one day, and there was a lady that was a manager of that. She got to know me and wanted to know what I did for a living, and I told her, and she was glad, and I gave her a card, and she even came to church on a couple of occasions. So I was there one day, and I came in, and she came in, and she come back there. She said, "Are you busy?" And I said, "No." She said, "Well, can I talk to you?" And I said, "Yes." So she sat down and talked to me, and what it was, she was a lesbian, and I didn't know that. And she just come out and asked me, "What did I think?" And I said, "Well, I can show you what the Bible says." Okay. But then she started this thing like, "Well, I don't believe that God would hold it against me for how to find happiness and things of that sort. All the things that people bring up." And I said, "But the Bible says," and we pointed it out, "that you're going to be judged by what the Bible says." And so she didn't know. She didn't come back to the church anymore. Matter of fact, she moved away. She actually moved in with the woman that she was, quote, in love with. So sometimes we have people, because of we're going to stand for what's right and so forth. We did have at Carsville at one time. That's right. I obeyed the gospel. A man that was a homosexual, but he wasn't a practicing homosexual, and he was brought up in the church, and he was restored, and so on. Okay, now we're going to talk about. Let me see here. The date of Jesus' birth. Y'all have the book. You may have read the book. And it's interesting when you read the book to see what the book has to say. But we mentioned in lesson 5 that no one in the early church had reliable information about the month or the day that Jesus' birth. Now, remember, we say that, and remember what we have just talked about in reference to the calendar, the months, the days, the years, and so forth. Just remember that among that of the Jewish people and how they kept all of that. But both Matthew and Luke tell us all they can about the year. In Luke 2, verse 2, it ties it to the registration ordered by Augustus, which took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, on page 167 in Brother Ferguson's book, he also makes reference to this time. And also he, not only on page 167, but on page 208, he also refers to that. But again, as we look upon those things, he brings them up, and he gives some type of date like 27 BC, whatever datings he uses there. But again, the conclusion is that we do not know. And so, but we do know about these things that Matthew and Luke tells us. So when we look at Quirinius, this was likely a census. In our biblical archaeology class, we just covered this census. It wasn't a tax. And so although new taxes followed the census and triggered a revolt led by Julius the Galilean in AD 6 and 7, according to Luke 5 and verse 37. But they didn't do censuses like we do. We do them every 10 years. They just did them whenever they thought they ought to do them. And so that's what they did. We've already discussed some of the problems connected with the dating of that census back in lesson 3. And also, we have some things in archaeology. Augustus took several of those censuses. He took us in an official history of his reign, but the one closest in time to presumed date of Jesus' birth was begun in 8 BC. The next one was AD 14. So this census of 8 BC covered only Judea, not Galilee, and was ordered because the Romans were converting Judea to a province. So they wanted to know how many people were there. So the Romans usually allowed 5 years to complete a census, so Jesus' birth could not or could have occurred while this one was in progress, but there's still the problem of Quirinius' governorship. Now, in Matthew chapter 2 and in verse 1, if you want to turn there, we find that it says, now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, now we know where that is, in the day of Herod the king, now we can figure out the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east and that of Jerusalem. And then when you turn to Luke chapter 1, Matthew, Mark, Luke chapter 1, And verse 5, that he tells us, there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judah, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of Abijah, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Now, both the date of the date, both of them date the birth of Jesus to the days of Herod, king of Judea. Now, that was significant information because Herod ruled from 37 to 4 BC, according to the dates that are given. So it only tantalizes us when during those 3 decades was Jesus born. How could he have been born BC, that is before Christ? Some have tried to maintain that Herod died later than 4 BC, but there is little substance to that argument, and it looks like that there is a major chronological problem here, but there need not be if we remember that Luke said Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. 34 or 35 is about 30. So for people who treat numbers as carelessly as the Greeks and the Romans did, so, you look at that. But I think there's something else and that Luke gives us there. And I'm trying to remember where I got this, and I may still have some of it in the file. But he says there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of Abijah. Now, the course of Abijah is the 9th course. There are 48 courses. Now, that simply means that Zacharias, he was of the 9th course, so he would be the 9th week, or it could have been up to the 13th week because of the 4 festivals, 12 to 13. Festivals, Pentecost, Feast of Tabernacles, the Passover, 3 of those. So it could have been 12 weeks. Up to 12 weeks, he would anywhere from the 9th to the 12th week, he would have to serve in the temple. And then after all 48 of them served, I'm sorry, let's say 48, 24. They served twice, made it 48. So within that time, he would have served twice in a year. But then the other times that they all served during those festivals. And so they would serve those 3 or 4 times. How many festivals they had were all the priests had to serve. So that gives you something because if you remember, John the Baptist was 6 months older than Jesus the Christ. And so a person could actually, someone has, and I can't remember where I have it, and I'll try to find it. But anyway, that to me seems like it's even more so that it would help us to understand that. But from other bits of information in Matthew's introduction, we can narrow the date down. He says in chapter 1 and verse 17 that 14 generations lived from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ. In the Jewish setting, a generation was normally reckoned at 40 years. So from Herodias, 448 to 425 BC, says that the 3 generations of men are 100 years. So Matthew seems to be figuring approximately 560 years from the fall of Jerusalem to that of the birth of Jesus. And so Jerusalem fell in 586, so that would date Christ's birth to 26 BC. But Matthew would have emphasized about 40 years in each generation and the approximately 560 years. And so the date could easily be brought down a few more years. For the modern, fast, curious reader, so imprecise, a date is not enough, but for Matthew's readers, it was. This should be a reminder that we can expect the ancient, the non-scientific text to be written with our standards of accuracy in mind. And so even Clement of Alexander discussed the problem of chronology and provided what information he had about the reigns of the emperors at the time and how that the elapsed since that of the birth of Christ. And by his reckoning, that is Clement of Alexander, Jesus was born the 28th year of Augustus. So modern scholars began figuring Augustus' reign in 27 BC. So when he received the grant of powers for the made an emperor, but Clement appears to have been counted from the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, and so which would place Jesus' birth around 3 BC. So he admits that different sources give various figures for the reign of some of the emperors. So most people, they will, I've always heard either 3 or 4 BC. I mean, that's what I've always seen when you look at the birth of Christ. They put 3 or 4 BC. But another clue to a more precise date is provided by the story of Herod's slaughter of the innocent. His command to slay all the male children of Bethlehem under 2 years of age in an effort to destroy what he understood to be a rival king of the Jews. It seems from the story, Matthew 1:16 through 20, that this happened just before Herod's death, though that is not explicitly stated. But since Herod died early in 4 BC, if he was looking for a child under 2, it would seem likely that Jesus was born around 6 BC. Some scholars argue 8 or 7 BC, and others 3 to 2 BC. So on the basis of what appears to be a star map painted on the ceiling of a catacomb in Rome, one of the scholars maintains that Christ's birth took place March the 24th and 25th, 5 BC. And so in 1606, Johannes Kepler calculated that Jesus was born in 7 to 6 BC during a rare conjunction of Jupiter, the star of kings, and Saturn, the star of the Sabbath and sometimes of the Jews. Others have tried to identify the star, Matthew 2:2, with a nova or with a comet. Did any of y'all see that meteor that fell today here in the area? I guess y'all did. I didn't either. But they had some kind of meteor that burned out and fell, come across the sky. The major difficulty in using the story of the slaughter of the innocent as evidence is that it is not known from any other source, and not even another New Testament source. There are some possible reasons for the silence. Bethlehem was a small place, and the infant mortality rate of the times was high. Since only males were sought out, only the slaughter might have involved only a handful of babies. So thus it may not have seemed worthy of note to Josephus and even other the historians of that day to talk anything about Herod's slaughter of that of members of his own family. And so they might have thought it unwise to mention the matter when it would only raise questions. So what happened to this alleged king of the Jews? And the inquiring reader might want to know. So we know that Josephus, as a client of Herod Agrippa II, tried to avoid delicate issues in the history of the Jews. He just didn't want to mention them. So we cannot know why Matthew alone records the incident. We don't have to disregard it simply because it is found only in one source. Now, again, with our understanding that we usually say, well, Matthew was written either between 50 to 57 AD, and yet Matthew wrote to the Jew. So that might be the reason that the Holy Spirit guided Matthew to write about that thing. But other incidents from antiquity are accepted as historical, even though recorded by only one author or maybe only one inscription. Our sources are limited in number. They have a selective, unscientific approach to recording information, so we should not be quick to accept everything they tell us or too eager to reject any particular piece of data. Even clues from the Dead Sea Scrolls or even from astronomy. Now, ultimately, Judas, the Maccabean, interpreted to mean the hammer, entered Jerusalem, and he cleansed the temple, where for 3 years sacrifices had been offered to the Olympian Zeus on the 25th of let me get this right. Chesley. I don't think it's well. Anyway, that's the Chesley. That's the Jewish month, but it's the month of December, 165 BC. The day has been celebrated ever since as a feast of Hanukkah, or the rededication or lights. The story of the Maccabean Wars or the military struggles, reference to that dynasty we're going to talk more about that later. But when we think about that place of Jesus' birth, and we bring that up because of the December 25th, the place of Jesus' birth, Bethlehem, as we said, was a little town, and it's on the caravan route, and it was between Jerusalem and between that of Egypt, by the way of Hebrew. That fact would later facilitate Joseph's flight with the infant Jesus. The place, some 5 miles from the south of Jerusalem, gained new importance when Herod built his fortress, Herodium, and Masada, because Bethlehem overlooked the roads to those fortresses. And those are such, again, if we had a way to show a PowerPoint, to show you the beautiful places that they picture those to be. In the 2nd century, a tradition existed that Jesus' birth had occurred in a certain cave that had been behind the inn. And apparently many people lived in caves in the area or used them for stables. And if Mary had lived in a cave in Nazareth, it would not have been extremely unusual for Mary and Joseph to stay in one now. The argument that the traditional cave was too small to be used as a stable is not very strong because its present division into sections is misleading. So this cave is presumably the same one that the Emperor Hadrian, AD 117-138, desecrated by including it in a grove dedication to Tammuz Adonis. And at that time, both Bethlehem and Jerusalem were declared off limits to the Jews. Now, if Jesus was properly swallowed and did indeed look like a little mummy, he might easily have been placed in a manger like this one in the Good Samaritan Inn on the road to that of Jericho. There's no reason why he had to be put in a long trough on the ground as usually portrayed in our Christian manger scenes. But we really don't know because we don't have all of that information. Now, a thing comes up, and this kind of bothers me because it's hard sometimes about dating. You know, the BC and the AD, and then they have the BC and the BCE. You know, it's just like when I first started watching college football, they had the SEC and all these Southwestern Conference SWC and the top with the 10 and then the 12 and all that. I didn't know what in the world they were talking about. Well, this BC and AD, given all this confusion and lack of precision, it's little wonder that people interested in the antiquity often have trouble to understand how we keep track of things. And we've even complicated the problem by using the birth of Christ as our reference point. A student, this fellow tells us, a student in one of his history classes was asked in all seriousness, before Jesus was born, how did they know to count backwards so the dates would come out right? And so his first reaction was disbelief. Could a college student actually have no notion at all of how our dating system works? And sad to say, I encountered others since then. So in brief, let me explain BC and BC, B period C period and B period C period with a comma, and how we can correlate Roman and Greek Christian dates. I have problems with that, as we've had in this book. Our modern system was worked out by Diogenes Exiguus, a monk living in Rome in the mid-6th century, using information like Luke's reference to Jesus' beginning his ministry when he was about 30 in the 15th year of Tiberius. And so Diogenes decided to designate that year as the 30th year of our Lord, Anno Domini, in Latin, BC. He went on to contrast a chronology of events up to his own time. His problem was complicated by the difficulty of performing calculations with Roman numerals and by the lack of a zero. We talked about that zero in lesson 1. Therefore, he had Jesus was born BC 1, that is the first year of our Lord, by Diogenes calculation. So minor inaccuracies in record keeping meant that the system he devised was actually off by 4 to 6 years. So we have seen the problems of correlated dates from one kingdom or city to another. So when two cities fought one another, each one would record the event in its own history using its own time, the way they did their time. So when these two cities fought, such cross-reference allowed later historians to correlate events in one dating system with those in another. So by the 4th century, several elaborate chronologies have been worked out by Christian writers such as Eusebius and Jerome to show the connection between the events of the Old Testament and the Greco-Roman. Now, what's really helped along that line since then is this: when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls and also the Babylonian Chronicle. Now, some modern scholarly publications and add another twist to the timekeeping problem by trying to avoid the Christian implication of dating things BC. The designation BCE and CE are coming into wider use. And so BCE means before the Common Era and Common Era. The Common Era is the time period since the birth of Christ. The use of these phrases is intended to avoid offending non-Christians. The use of this system doesn't change any dates. The year 480 BC is also 480 BCE, and 49 CE, Common Era, is BC 79. If that makes any sense to you. I don't know. I haven't seen the AD. That's my problem. So I'm assuming that when he uses the 79 CE, the Common Era, there, that he comes back and says 79 CE Common Era is BC 79. What they do, the year 4080 BC, the BC's after the year, then it's before Christ. And if it's before the year, BC 79, it's before the Common Era. I got that right. Y'all can study that. I like BC and AD myself. But then that brings us to that of distances. You know, again, we have GPS. You know, can you imagine if somebody could be brought back then and you show them a GPS? So when you think about ancient culture, practically every ancient city had its own method of calculating time. They also had their own systems of measurements, their weights, whether for weights, volume, money, or distance. Weights and volume are of no particular importance for the study of the New Testament, and Roman coinage has become the standard medium of exchange all over the Mediterranean world, except in the Temple of Jerusalem, where it had to be exchanged or by with rates for coins which did not bear the emperor's image. But an understanding of how distances were calculated can provide an introduction to the important topic of travel that we're going to talk about in reference to the New Testament world. The shortest distances were measured by comparison with body parts. Now, anything smaller than a foot was measured by the dactyl. That is the distance between two knuckles on a man's finger. Now, the foot was the basic unit of measure, but it varied 296 millimeters or 11 inches at Rome to 320 millimeters in Olympia and 330 millimeters in Gaul. So you can see the problem. The Athenians used two different feet in measuring. One 295 millimeters and the other 326 millimeters. So we have graphic evidence of the measurement of the Roman foot at a point where the Appian Way runs between the hills and the coastlines of Italy. Engineers cut off 126 feet off the cliff to construct the roadbed and mark off each foot. And you'll see a marker, milestone erect during the Trajan reign when you get the notes. But the most common unit in the Near East was the cubit. And the distance from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, from there to there, or knee, it continued in use in the Romans' time. Matthew 6:27 in the New Revised Standard Version makes a note there, and resisted all efforts to standardize it. Now, longer distance was measured. Now, we usually say, and what I've always said is that that's 18 inches. And so sometimes when I'm doing something, I need to know how long it is. That's what I do. I use this to this. It says 18 inches, and from my right there, the end of my hand to the top of that finger is about 8 inches, 7 to 8 inches. So, you know. But longer distance were measured rather arbitrarily. In their games, the Greeks used the stadium, the length of the running track. Now, this was defined as 600 feet, but since the foot varied from place to place, so did the stadium. So the Romans were hardly more precise, using the milla passus, 1,000 steps, as their standard. Now, when we were in Vietnam, we counted, and every normal step was 30 inches. And so that's how we would count. If we had to go so far, we would know. You put 30 inches, divide 30 inches into how many steps you took, make the feet, and see how far you were. And maybe 33 inches. I never did have to. I don't think I remember ever doing that, but that's what we had to do. But the step usually reckoned as 5 feet, making the Roman mile about 300 feet shorter than our mile. So the Greeks, Romans were used professional distances, distant measurers and surveyors when calculating distance between cities, so they could achieve rough accuracy. So the distance were marked on Roman roads by milestones, and that's what you'll see in the notes or in the book. Large columns displaying the name of the road, the name and the titles of the officials who built on it. That sounds like us today. You ever go see a building and all of a sudden it says the name of the building and tells you who built it and what year they built it in? Shows the distance from the two towns which the roads connect, and these milestones were normally 5 to 6 feet tall. Construction and erection of them served to keep unemployed people occupied and provided propaganda for the current regime. Now, the most common measurement of a long distance was a day's journey. Now, under optimum circumstances in antiquity, a person could cover about 20 of our miles in a day's travel on foot. But circumstances were rarely ideal, and people really struck out alone on foot, or rarely. Imperial couriers could cover as much as 50 miles a day. An ox-drawn wagon could manage only 7 or 8 miles a day. And so since we don't know how Mary and Joseph were traveling, we cannot be certain how far they had gone when we read in Luke 2 and verse 44 that they left Jerusalem and went a day's journey before they realized that Jesus was not with them. We don't know how long that was. I always thought it was about 5 miles, but that may have been more, may have been less. But they had assumed him to be among the family and friends and as they were traveling, so that suggests a caravan of some sort, almost certainly with wagons, and reminds us of one of the most important conditions in ancient travel, safety and that of numbers. And so the concept of the day's journey was almost as old as civilization in the Near East. In Genesis 30 and 36, or Near East, Genesis 30 and 36 and Exodus 3 and verse 18, we find references to a 3-day journey. Now, because of Sabbath restrictions, the Jews introduced a variation of this measurement, the Sabbath day's journey, barely more than a half a mile, Acts 1 and verse 12. And so, you could only go that far. Now, when we think about their journeys, then we think about, our highways. And our highways and their highways are not the same. Highways provided an efficient communication system, a rapid postal system, transporting mail across the empire with relays of horses or mules. We thought the West thought of that, but no, they had something like that. Any province, any governor of a province or any official of the empire could send a message to the capital and get an answer back within about a week. So the Assyrian road system anticipated the famous and better known Persian road system of a later period. So each country would have their own road system and how that they would fix those. Now the donkey, the ass, as it's said, served as a primary pack animal, and we've seen that because we have those westerns, Not only that, if you ever been to the Grand Canyon, they get you on one of those donkeys, and you can go down there if you have the courage to do that. Ride one of those down those slopes and so forth. Not me. I love life. But quantities of goods also are moved on the Tigris River through that in the central part of the empire. Substantial quays have been excavated at Nineveh and Caleb. The vessel used for shipment consisted of a large raft buoyed up by inflated skins of sheep and goats. And boats also traveled on the irrigation canals and provided ferry services there on the river. And several boats would be tied together to create a bridge across a river or a major canal. Now, again, going back to movies and things that we've seen in reference to the West, and how that the West was won and so forth, and things they did. We saw some of the same things taking place, way back then. Now, Brother Ferguson talks about the travel in numerous pages. And I'm going to see if I mark these. Sometimes I don't mark something to read, so I'll have to look. I got 2 places I want to go to. Okay, page 86. He talks about trade and so forth, and I'm not going to go from our book. I'm going to go to Brother Ferguson's book and look at it, and then we're going to stop our class. to next week. But he talks about trade and travel. And again, I have a good friend that's a truck driver. I have two good friends that are truck drivers. And do you know that if the trucking industry was just to say, we're not going to do this anymore and stop, we would be in bad trouble. Bad trouble. We get more food by trucks than we do any other way, unless you grow your own. But he talks in the book, Brother Ferguson does, about trade and travel. He says, he talks about that of trade routes. He says travel followed the trade routes. Sea travel, and we'll talk more about this too, was dangerous but frequent. If you go back, if you recall, excuse me, Acts 27, 1 through 8, there's a route described there. And the route most frequently traveled by travelers, most important in the early history of Christianity, was the great central route that made Ephesus and Corinth such significant transit points. And so from which Christianity radiated into other areas. Antioch and Alexandria were great commercial centers in the east, a point of contact for Syria and Egypt, respectively, with the Roman world. Now, I stop and sometimes think, because when I teach like the book of Acts, I know that they go sea travel some, but yet there is a way that they had roads there. And again, if we had the PowerPoint, we could show the different roads that they had. But you can actually trace the way that Paul does the missionary journeys and the places that they go. And you can see that, how they got there. There was a time where he came to one point where he had to get on a ship. So they did have that of travel. Sea travel was dangerous but frequent. There was a literary convention among classical authors to speak about travel, especially by sea, but there is abundance of evidence of contrary practice. Merchants obviously traveled. An inscription from the 2nd century AD records that a man from Hierapolis in Phrygia sailed around the southern coast of Greece 72 times on journeys to Italy. So also did the military, government officials, and all sorts of other people. Sea transportation was mainly on the commercial cargo vessels. And we see, when we read the book of Acts, what was Paul put on to get him to Rome? It was the cargo vessel, which they had to empty that thing up. But on the local routes, the ships did not normally sail at night, and passengers would sleep in port or on the beach. And sailing was normally suspended during the winter. You'll notice in Acts chapter 27, 9 through 12, even 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 13, where Paul wants his coat. From about November to 10th to March the 10th, and the only really stage season was between May the 26th and that of September the 14th. So in order to maintain the grain supply in Rome, the Emperor Claudius guaranteed a profit and insurance against loss by storm for traders bringing grain to Rome in the winter, and that many account for the willingness of the captains and ship owners, like Acts chapter 27, 11 and 12, to take the risk involved in reaching a better harbor for the winter. So the narrative in Acts 27 and 28, and Lucian, the ship or the wishes, chapters 1 through 15, are principal sources on sea travel in the early empire. Now, James Smith, The Voyage and the Shipwreck of St. Paul, is 4th edition, written in 1978. The Roman peace and suppression of piracy gave greater safety to that of sea travel. So the Roman contribution to make land travel was a more positive one. And that's the reason why I say when we see that Paul is going to Rome, he's going by ship, but we can also notice how he traveled by that of the land. Of the many roads, two are well known. We've already talked via Appian Way, and let's see if I can see the other one. The Via Egnatia began in 145 BC, soon after Macedonia was conquered. It ran from the west coast of Greece to Neapolis on the northeast coast, and eventually to Byzantium. Roman armies moved across it in struggles between Caesar and Pompey, and between Octavian and the forces of Brutus and Caius, and so forth. Paul's missions activity at Derbe, Iconium, and Pisidia, Antioch was on the main Roman road that led from Antioch of Syria and Tarsus to Ampere, Pamia, Laodicea, and Ephesus. And here he gives a bunch of verses from the book of Acts. Troas also And so you can actually go over to Antioch, and to me, as I see it, it's like you go up, and here's Palestine on this side over here. You go up like this, Mount Carmel, and you go up, and then it turns like this to Mediterranean. Right up in there is Antioch of Syria, and you can see where he would go on that of land if you have a map. Okay? And so he even has a picture, Brother Ferguson does, of the Nation Way in Philippi. Was the main road across Macedonia. It runs alongside the Forum of Philippi and is paralleled by a modern highway today. So he tells us about those. The traveler was not so frustrated in the accommodations for the night. We'll talk about accommodations also. Any questions or comments you'd like to make?
Don't think so.
Y'all must be asleep.
No, not yet.
Not yet. We'll cover some more of those things in detail because, like I said, I do have some other information so that we'll be able to take our time. We have 5 more classes. That's 10 more hours. And so then y'all will be through with me and have a good summer. You like me, I'm going to travel in the summer. I'm going up to see the Ark up in Kentucky. Then I'm going to see the Creation Science Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. Is that where it's at? Somewhere up in there.
Kentucky.
Where? Well, the
northern Kentucky.
The Ark is in Kentucky. You go up to Christian Science. So you go, here's Kentucky, here's Louisville. Then you go up, and there's the Ark. And then you go up, and they go across in Ohio. Somewhere right in there, they have that museum for creation science. And so we're Bobby and Reba Wood, and Lynn and I are going to go up. Nice Friday in May. We're going on Memorial Day. Will we get in free? That's $60 a piece, we say. Bobby Wood and I get in free because it's Memorial Day, and they let us go. Being better. And so that's just one of the trips we're going to take in the summer. Unless y'all want to give me $1,895. I wouldn't go. I'm just kidding. I wouldn't go.
Rita will give you the money.
Huh?
Rita will give you the money.
Rita, give me money. She's pointing her finger towards you. So you want got the bill for? I was telling Tommy earlier. I said I would like to go, but with the problem that I have to be close to a hospital. Like I have a temperature of 98.5, and in 15 minutes is 103.7. You got to be close. But I'm doing great. The medicine is working, and so it's good to go. But I can read about it, and I can see it on the internet. Okay, y'all have a good night, a good weekend, right. And we'll see you, Lord willing.
See you next week.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Bye, Rebecca. She probably done gone to sleep. She was sick.
Oh no.
Good night.
Good night.